The morning started like any other, quiet, ordinary, and safe, until I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. At first I thought it was a delivery slip. But the moment I read the words, my stomach dropped. Violation notice: unauthorized structure. Remove immediately. My shed. The one I built with my own hands. The one I checked every rule for before hammering in the first nail. According to the HOA, it was illegal, and if I didn't tear it down within 7 days, fines would start piling up. Thousands of dollars, maybe more. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a shed. This was a fight. I stood there staring at the paper, replaying the months of work I had poured into that small wooden structure behind my house. It wasn't some giant eyesore. It was neat, painted to match the home, tucked behind the fence where nobody could even see it from the street. I had built it to store tools and keep my garage clear. I thought I had done everything right. I checked city guidelines, looked at setback rules, even asked a contractor friend for advice. Nothing about it seemed wrong. But the HOA didn't care about my effort. Their letter was cold, official, and final, or at least they wanted me to believe it was final. I called the number listed on the notice and got transferred 3 times before someone finally answered. The voice on the other end sounded rehearsed, almost bored. She told me the shed violated community standards and needed approval before construction. I explained that city code allowed it. She paused for exactly 1 second and said, "City rules and HOA rules are different. You agreed to those rules when you moved in." That sentence hit harder than I expected. It felt like being told my own property wasn't really mine. Later that evening, I walked out to the backyard and looked at the shed in silence. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass, and I couldn't stop thinking about the time and money I had invested. My neighbor, Tom, leaned over the fence and asked what was wrong. When I showed him the notice, his eyes widened. "They did the same thing to my cousin," he said. "They don't back down easily." That night I barely slept. I kept imagining workers tearing the shed down, boards crashing to the ground, months of effort gone in a day. But one thought kept circling in my head: what if the HOA was wrong? I didn't know it yet, but that question would lead me into a battle involving rules, power, and a city office that would completely change the situation. The next morning, I woke up with one clear thought: if I was going to fight this, I needed facts, not emotions. The HOA letter sat on my kitchen table like a threat, but I refused to let panic make my decisions. I grabbed my folder of house documents, receipts, and permits and started reading every line I had saved since moving in. Buried deep in the paperwork was the community handbook, pages and pages of rules that most homeowners skim once and forget. That day, I read every single word. At first, it felt hopeless. The language was vague, full of phrases like community appearance and board discretion. It never clearly said sheds were banned, but it mentioned that exterior structures required approval. That was the part the HOA was using against me. Still, something felt off. If approval was required, why did several other homes nearby have storage units in their backyards? I started making notes, writing down addresses and details like a detective building a case. By midday, frustration turned into determination. I drove around the neighborhood slowly, counting sheds, small workshops, even one oversized playhouse that looked bigger than mine. Some were newer than mine, clearly built recently. If the rule applied equally, why were those still standing? The inconsistency made me suspicious. Maybe enforcement wasn't about rules at all, maybe it was about who complained and who didn't. When I got back home, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. This one wasn't a warning. It was a fine, $200 already added to my account for non-compliance. My chest tightened. They hadn't even waited for me to respond. It felt like punishment before a trial. I called the HOA again, this time asking for a hearing. The board representative spoke politely but firmly. You may present your case at next month's meeting, she said. Next month. That meant more fines before I could even explain. I asked if there was anything I could do sooner. Her answer was simple: remove the shed. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized they were counting on me giving up on me, deciding it wasn't worth the stress. But every time I looked out the window at that little building, I felt stubbornness growing. That evening, Tom came over again. He listened quietly while I explained everything I had found. Then he said something that changed the direction of the entire fight. Forget the HOA for a second, he said. What does the city say? I paused. I had checked city rules before building, but I hadn't talked to anyone directly. Tom shrugged. Go down there. Get it in writing. HOAs act tough until a city official says otherwise. The idea lit a spark of hope. Maybe the answer wasn't fighting the HOA alone. Maybe the real power was somewhere else. The next morning, I decided to visit the city office, and that decision would change everything. I walked into the city planning office expecting long lines, confusing paperwork, and maybe someone handing me another set of rules I didn't fully understand. Instead, I found a quiet room with maps on the walls and a receptionist who looked up with a calm smile. I explained my situation: the shed, the HOA notice, the fines already starting, and she nodded like she'd heard stories like mine many times before. That alone made me feel less alone. She directed me to a zoning officer named Mr. Alvarez. He invited me to sit down and asked for the address of my property. His fingers moved quickly across his keyboard while I watched the screen reflect in his glasses. For a few long seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he leaned back and said words I wasn't expecting: as far as city code is concerned, your shed is completely legal. I blinked, unsure if I had heard correctly. He explained that my lot size allowed accessory structures up to a certain square footage, and my shed was well within the limit. The placement was fine too, more than enough distance from the property line. No permit was even required for something that small. I felt a mix of relief and disbelief wash over me. All those sleepless nights, all those warnings, and according to the city, I hadn't done anything wrong. I asked the question that had been weighing on me. Then why is the HOA saying it's illegal? Mr. Alvarez gave a small, knowing smile. HOAs can create additional rules, he said carefully. But they can't enforce city code. And they often make things sound more official than they actually are. He paused before adding, if you want something strong for your records, I can print the zoning confirmation. When he handed me the document, it felt like holding a shield. The paper clearly stated that the shed complied with city regulations. I read it twice just to make sure it was real. For the first time since this started, I felt like I wasn't powerless. On my way out, another employee overheard my conversation and stopped me. Just a heads up, she said quietly. HOAs sometimes back down when homeowners show official documentation. But sometimes they double down first. That warning stayed with me during the drive home. I placed the city letter next to the HOA notice on my kitchen table. The contrast was almost funny: one accusing me of breaking rules, the other confirming everything was fine. I took a photo of both documents side by side, knowing this might become important later. That evening, I emailed the HOA, attaching the city confirmation and politely requesting that the violation be removed. I expected a quick correction. Maybe even an apology. Instead, the reply arrived an hour later, short, sharp, and colder than before. City approval does not override HOA governing documents. Violation stands. I stared at the screen, anger rising in my chest. They didn't even acknowledge the evidence. It wasn't about legality anymore. It felt personal. I realized then that this fight wasn't ending quickly, and the next move would push things into a whole new level of tension. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the small community clubhouse, a place usually reserved for birthday parties and holiday decorations, not battles over property rights. As I walked toward the building, the city letter folded neatly inside a folder under my arm. My heart pounded harder than I expected. I kept telling myself this was simple. I had proof. The city said my shed was legal. Surely once the board saw that, the issue would end. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where 5 board members sat with stacks of papers in front of them. Neighbors whispered quietly, some curious, some clearly entertained. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, including people who had sheds of their own. That made me feel a little more confident until I noticed the board president watching me with a tight, unreadable expression. When my turn came, I walked to the front and explained everything calmly. I described how I checked the regulations before building, how the structure met city guidelines, and how I simply wanted to keep my tools organized. Then I placed the city document on the table like a final piece of evidence. For a moment, the room went silent. One board member adjusted her glasses and read the letter carefully. Another whispered something to the president. I expected them to nod, maybe even thank me for clarifying things. Instead, the president leaned into the microphone and said, "City code does not supersede HOA architectural standards." The words hit like a wall. I argued politely, pointing out that similar sheds existed in the neighborhood. The president responded that some were grandfathered in while others were still under review. The explanation sounded vague, almost rehearsed. I could feel frustration building in my chest. Then something unexpected happened. A man from the audience stood up. "I built my shed last year," he said. "Nobody told me I needed approval." Murmurs spread across the room. Another neighbor added that she had never received a violation notice either. Suddenly, the meeting wasn't just about me. The board looked uncomfortable. The president banged the gavel lightly and reminded everyone to stay on topic. He turned back to me and said the violation would remain active until I submitted a formal architectural application, and until then, fines would continue. I left the meeting with more questions than answers. Outside, a few neighbors approached me quietly, saying they thought the board was being unfair. One woman whispered, "They only go after people who challenge them." That comment echoed in my mind the entire walk home. When I checked my email later that night, another message from the HOA arrived. The fine had increased again. The total was already climbing fast. I stared at the screen, realizing something important. This was no longer about following rules. It was about control. And if I didn't push back harder, they would keep escalating. That was when I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I started documenting everything. That night, I opened a fresh notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of the first page: evidence log. If the HOA wanted to turn this into a long fight, I decided I would be ready. I wasn't just a frustrated homeowner anymore, I was someone preparing a case. Every email, every notice, every conversation would be documented from that moment on. The next morning, I walked around the neighborhood again, this time with purpose. I took clear photos of other sheds, storage units, and backyard structures. Some were small like mine. Others were twice the size. A few were painted bright colors that stood out far more than my neutral-toned shed ever did. I made sure to note addresses and dates, careful not to trespass or invade anyone's privacy. My goal wasn't to cause trouble for neighbors, it was to show inconsistency. As I worked, several neighbors stopped to talk. Word about the HOA meeting had spread quickly. One man told me he had received a warning years ago but ignored it and never heard back. Another admitted he had been asked to file paperwork but was approved without any issues. The more stories I heard, the clearer the pattern became. Enforcement seemed random, almost selective. Back at home, I organized everything into folders: city documents, HOA notices, photos, and handwritten notes. I even saved screenshots of my email exchanges. Looking at the growing stack gave me a strange sense of calm. For the first time, I felt prepared instead of cornered. Then something unexpected arrived in the mail, a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. The letter warned that continued non-compliance could lead to legal action and additional costs. Legal action. The phrase made my stomach knot. They weren't bluffing anymore. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, reading the letter over and over. Part of me wanted to give in, tear down the shed, and end the stress. But another part, a stronger part, refused to accept that I had done something wrong. The city said it was legal. Neighbors had similar structures. Why was I being pushed this hard? I called Tom and told him about the attorney's letter. He listened quietly before saying, "You might need to talk to someone who understands HOA law." The idea sounded intimidating, but it also made sense. I didn't want to make a mistake just because I didn't understand the system. That evening, I searched online for local attorneys experienced with HOA disputes. I read reviews, stories, and case outcomes late into the night. One thing became clear: many homeowners felt powerless until they learned their rights. Before going to bed, I placed the attorney's letter next to my evidence folder. It felt like the stakes had just doubled. This wasn't a neighborhood disagreement anymore. It was turning into something serious. And the next step I took, reaching out for professional help, would reveal something about the HOA that I never expected to hear. The law office was smaller than I expected, quiet, simple, and lined with shelves full of thick binders labeled with names I couldn't pronounce. I sat across from the attorney, Ms. Harper, sliding my folder of documents toward her. She didn't rush. She read everything carefully: the violation notices, the city confirmation letter, the photos, even the email exchanges I had printed. The longer she read, the more serious her expression became. When she finally looked up, she didn't start with legal jargon. She asked me one simple question. Did the HOA ever send you an architectural application before they started fining you? I shook my head. She nodded slowly, writing something down. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. They may be pushing beyond what they can legally enforce. She explained that HOAs do have authority, sometimes a lot of it, but they still have to follow their own governing documents. If their rules were unclear or if enforcement was inconsistent, homeowners could challenge them. She pointed to my photos of other sheds. Selective enforcement can become a problem for them, she said calmly. I felt a small spark of hope. For weeks, I had felt like I was standing alone against something bigger than me. Hearing a professional confirm that the situation wasn't black and white made me sit up a little straighter. But then she leaned forward and gave me a warning. This can get expensive if it turns into a legal battle, she said. HOAs often rely on homeowners backing down because most people don't want to fight. Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't promising an easy win. She suggested a first step: send a formal response letter on legal letterhead, requesting that the fines stop until the dispute was reviewed properly. It wasn't a lawsuit, more like a strong signal that I understood my rights. I agreed immediately. As she drafted the letter, she explained another detail that made my stomach tighten. Some boards take legal letters personally, she said. They might escalate before they back down. I left the office with mixed emotions, nervous, but also empowered. The letter felt like a turning point, proof that I wasn't helpless anymore. When it arrived at the HOA office 2 days later, I imagined the board opening it and realizing I wasn't going away quietly. The response came faster than I expected. Instead of backing off, the HOA sent another notice. The fines were still active, and now they claimed additional administrative fees for legal review. I stared at the email in disbelief. It felt like they were trying to scare me into submission. I forwarded the message to Ms. Harper, and her reply came almost instantly: keep everything. Do not respond emotionally. We're building a record. That night, I walked into my backyard and stood beside the shed. The air was quiet, the wood still strong, unchanged despite all the chaos surrounding it. I realized this wasn't just about a structure anymore. It had become a test of how far I was willing to go. And the very next week, something happened that would shift the entire balance, an unexpected inspection that nobody saw coming. 3 days after the HOA ignored the attorney's letter, a white city truck pulled up in front of my house. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I saw a man step out wearing an official vest, my heart jumped. For a split second, I thought the HOA had somehow convinced the city to come after me. But when he introduced himself as a municipal inspector, his tone was calm and professional. "I received a request to verify compliance on a backyard structure," he said, glancing at a clipboard. I immediately knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had triggered this, and I could only guess who. I led him through the house into the backyard. He measured distances, checked the height, and walked slowly around the shed, taking notes. I watched silently, trying to read his expression. The entire inspection lasted less than 15 minutes. When he finished, he smiled slightly and said words I'll never forget. "Everything looks fine. You're within code." I felt relief rush through me so quickly I almost laughed. He explained that complaints often resulted in inspections, but as long as structures met regulations, there was nothing to worry about. Before leaving, he handed me a small printed report confirming compliance. Another official document, another piece of proof. The moment he drove away, I took photos of the report and emailed it to Ms. Harper. Her response came quickly: "Excellent. This strengthens your position." For the first time, it felt like momentum was shifting. But the real shock came that evening. A neighbor knocked on my door, looking nervous. She said she had overheard part of a conversation between two board members at the clubhouse. Apparently, the HOA didn't expect me to push back this hard. They assumed I would remove the shed after the first fine. Now, with legal representation and city confirmation, they were unsure how to proceed. Hearing that changed something inside me. The fear I'd been carrying started to fade. They weren't all powerful. They were just people making decisions, and those decisions could be challenged. Still, the situation wasn't resolved. The fines were technically still active, and the HOA hadn't officially withdrawn the violation. I knew better than to celebrate too early. 2 days later, a new email arrived, not from the usual board representative, but from the HOA president himself. The message was short and formal, requesting a private discussion to resolve the matter amicably. The sudden change in tone felt strange. Just days earlier they were threatening legal action, now they wanted to talk. I called Ms. Harper immediately. She advised me to attend but to remain cautious. "When parties want a private conversation after pushing hard," she said, "it usually means something has changed." That evening, I walked into the clubhouse again, same room, same table, but a completely different energy. The board looked serious, almost uneasy. And what they said next would reveal the real reason this entire conflict started in the first place. The clubhouse felt different that evening, quieter, heavier, like everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The same board members sat behind the long table, but their confident expressions were gone. The HOA president motioned for me to sit, and for the first time since this started, his tone sounded almost careful. "We'd like to resolve this situation without further escalation," he began. I nodded but said nothing. I had learned that silence made people explain more. The president cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. It was a proposed agreement. If I submitted an architectural application retroactively, the board would consider reducing the fines. The wording made me cautious. It still sounded like they wanted me to admit fault even though the city had confirmed everything was legal. I asked a simple question. Why was my shed targeted in the first place? For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the board members sighed and answered quietly. "We received multiple complaints." That surprised me. My shed wasn't visible from the street. Only nearby neighbors could even see it. I asked who complained, but they refused to say names. Still, the conversation had already cracked open something deeper. Another member admitted that the board had recently faced criticism for not enforcing rules consistently. They were under pressure to prove they were taking violations seriously. My shed, built recently and easy to identify, became the example. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. I wasn't targeted because my shed was harmful, I was targeted because they needed to look strict. I explained that the city inspection had confirmed full compliance and that my attorney advised against signing anything that implied wrongdoing. The president's jaw tightened slightly. He said HOAs had the right to maintain community standards beyond city laws. I agreed, but I pointed out that selective enforcement wasn't fair. The room fell quiet again. Then something unexpected happened. One of the board members, the same woman who had been silent during most meetings, spoke up. She said she wasn't comfortable continuing fines when the structure met city code and when similar sheds existed throughout the neighborhood. The tension at the table was obvious. This was the first sign that the board itself wasn't fully united. After nearly an hour of discussion, they asked for a short break. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my mind racing. I wasn't sure if I was winning or just surviving. When they called me back in, the president spoke carefully. The board is willing to suspend further fines while we review enforcement policies, he said. It wasn't a full victory, but it was the first real step backward from their aggressive position. I left the meeting feeling lighter, but the conflict wasn't over yet. The violation still existed on paper, and the board hadn't officially cleared the shed. 2 days later, I received an email titled "Final Decision." I opened it slowly, expecting another twist. What I read next would finally bring this long fight to its turning point and reveal whether standing my ground had been worth every sleepless night. I stared at the email subject line for almost a full minute before opening it. Final decision. After weeks of notices, fines, meetings, and sleepless nights, everything came down to whatever was written inside that message. My hands felt strangely calm as I clicked. The letter began formally, as always, references to bylaws, committee reviews, and board deliberations. Then I reached the part that made me stop breathing for a second. The violation associated with the backyard shed has been removed. All accrued fines are hereby rescinded. I read the sentence twice, just to make sure it was real. The HOA was backing down. The letter explained that after reviewing city documentation, inspection reports, and enforcement history within the neighborhood, the board decided to close the case. They also announced that the community guidelines would be clarified to avoid similar disputes in the future. In other words, they realized the problem wasn't just my shed, it was how the rules were being applied. I leaned back in my chair, a wave of relief washing over me. The stress that had been sitting in my chest for weeks suddenly lifted. I walked outside into the backyard and looked at the shed standing exactly where it had always been, solid, quiet, unchanged. The difference was inside me. It no longer felt like a target. It felt like proof. Later that evening, neighbors started texting me after hearing the news. Some were happy. Others were surprised that someone had actually pushed back and won. One message stood out from Tom: "Told you the city mattered." I laughed for the first time in days. But the biggest realization came later that night when everything was quiet. This fight had never really been about wood and nails. It was about understanding your rights, asking questions, and not assuming authority is always correct just because it sounds official. I almost tore the shed down in those first days out of fear. If I had, I never would have learned how much power homeowners actually have when they stay calm and informed. A week later, the HOA sent a community-wide notice announcing new procedures for approving backyard structures. The tone was noticeably softer, encouraging communication instead of immediate penalties. Whether they admitted it or not, the situation had forced change. I kept the city letter, the inspection report, and even the first violation notice in a folder, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. Sometimes standing your ground isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just refusing to give up when you know you're right.
Now, when I walk past that shade, I don't just see a storage space, I see the moment I stop it feeling powerless. And hear the truth, most people never hear. HOAs can feel overwhelming, but they are not untouchable. Rules matter, yes, but fairness matters too. And sometimes all it take is one person willing to ask, "Are you sure that's right?" This that question changed everything for me.